Let me tell you the story of Elizabeth Auntie Stone, the founding mother of Fort Collins, and the other women who tamed the West. This is a story that started 150 years ago. Abraham Lincoln was still president of the United States. And so many people came west for the opportunity for free land and the opportunity to grow, particularly for women who back east were very, very limited. They weren't able to go to college. They weren't able to become professionals. But in the West, there was more opportunity. And of course, the families themselves who traveled to the West on these old Conestoga wagons over dirt trails that were just barely able to be seen along the wilderness plains. It was a very, very tough life, and particularly for the women. With their families, they would have 8 to maybe as many as 12 children, but many of the children died young because of the difficulties of living. And of course, children were very important to the families because they were the working hands. They were the ones that helped mom and dad to farm and to gather the wood and to hunt for food and those types of things. And the mothers were responsible for making the clothes, doing the cooking, taking care of the children, taking care of all the medical needs, hauling the water in so that once a week the family could take a bath. Oh, those were interesting times where 2 or 3 people would use the bath water, and then the bath water would be used to clean the floors if there were wooden floors in the cabins, and then the rest of the water would be used to wash the overalls and other things that were there. So all of these things were important, and if it hadn't been for the women coming to the West, the schools wouldn't have been created. The churches wouldn't have been created. The hospitals were made. The libraries. The women made such a difference in that era. Now, I talked to you about Auntie Stone. Auntie Stone was 62 years old when she and her husband arrived in what was known as Camp Collins in 1864. She was 62 years old already. And as she and her husband arrived, the first thing that they did was to run the dining hall for the officers of Camp Collins. 2 years later, her husband died. But she went on, and in fact, the Camp Collins was closed just 3 years after they arrived. The military left, but that didn't stop Auntie Stone. What she had done with the dining hall was turned into the first hotel. And not only that, but almost immediately thereafter, she discovered that, the farmers would bring their wheat all the way to Wyoming to make flour. And she said, I'll create the first flour mill in what was then now called Fort Collins. And that she did with a 3-story building that was so large that she also had borders like another hotel. And these huge millstones that were part of that mill helped to make the flour that was then delivered in fine sifted flour around southern Wyoming and northern Colorado. There was a huge fire in Denver that burned almost all of the wooden buildings about 4 or 5 years before. Auntie Stone said, we can't let that happen to our buildings in Fort Collins. So she created the first brick-making kiln. And those bricks went into so many of the buildings that were then constructed in Fort Collins. Not only that, but at that point in time, the land grants were developed by Congress so that more settlers could come out to the West, and they could stake their claims on 160 acres of land. Now, they had to work that land for 5 years and spend at least 7 months each year on that land to qualify to get the title to the land. Auntie Stone filed one of the first women to do so, and she became not only the first landowner in Fort Collins, but also the first taxpayer. Well, Auntie Stone made so many things happen in Fort Collins. She was the person who was helping with the first baby born. And in addition to that, she continued to build her hotel and grow that hotel for many years thereafter. She, in fact, her first cabin that she and her Judge Stone, her husband, built and lived in before he died, was turned into the first school in Fort Collins. And you know, Auntie Stone was one of the primary people raising funds for the first college in Fort Collins, which ultimately became Colorado State University. Now, Auntie Stone lived until she was 94 years old. And the year before she died, she cast her first vote when Colorado allowed women to vote for the first time. And that was one of the most important things that Auntie Stone hoped to accomplish. Now, today, there is in Fort Collins an Auntie Stone Street. And in addition to that, her original cabin has been restored, and it's now available to see in Heritage Park in downtown Fort Collins, very, very close to the downtown library on Peterson Street. So the story of the women who tamed the West and the story of Auntie Stone is a story that I hope you'll remember. And if you want to hear more about those wonderful women in the West and what they were accomplishing, you can read the book Staking Her Claim, which was written by Marcia Meredith Hensley. It's available at the Poudre Library, and hopefully soon it will also be available here at the Clearview Library. I hope you've enjoyed that story of Auntie Stone. I'm Mike Forney from Spellbinders of Larimer County.